Peter Wise woke up with a start. He knew it wasn't time to get up, because through a chink in his bedroom curtains he could see a black and starry sky. There were none of the usual early morning sounds of Mrs. Wise frying bacon in the kitchen, or his father splashing in the bath, or the clink of bottles from the milkman on his rounds. It was very cosy in bed, and he had been in the middle of a most absorbing dream, but he couldn't remember what it was. All that remained was a snatch of tune running round his head. There it was again, this time not in his head, but floating in from outside the window. Someone was singing in the garden. Not bothering to put on his dressing gown, although it was quite cold, he jumped out of bed, ran to the window, and looked out. At that moment, the full moon disappeared behind a cloud, and in the pale starlight, it was impossible to see anything at all. However, the song continued, a little louder, if anything. Maybe it was a burglar. Oh, that's ridiculous. Burglars don't sing. Not when they're burgling, anyway. Perhaps I'll wake Mummy and Daddy, thought Peter. Just then the singing stopped, and once again the night seemed very still. Peter considered going back to bed, but by now he was so wide awake that he decided to go downstairs and investigate. In the kitchen, he found Roger and Beatrice, the household cats, sitting on the draining board and staring out of the window. "What do you think you're doing up there?" he said, in the tone of voice his mother always used for talking to the animals. Beatrice tried to make herself invisible behind a bottle of washing-up liquid, while Roger looked to left and right out of the corners of his eyes. "There's no law against stargazing," he said, suddenly, much to Peter's surprise. "Are you sure you don't know anything about someone singing in the back garden?" Singing?" said Roger. "Singing?" said Beatrice. They both jumped down from the draining board and into their basket, as if to put an end to the subject. The moon slid out from behind the clouds and suddenly flooded the garden with silver light. Peter's eye was instantly caught by a small, furry object that seemed to be dancing and swaying along the top of the garden wall. From it came a clear, singing voice. Quick as lightning, Roger, Beatrice, and Peter were all at the window, noses pressed against the pane. "It's a cat," said Peter. "It's Tallulah," said Roger and Beatrice. And Tallulah, with dark fur flying and green eyes flashing, performed to her audience of 3. No sooner had she finished than with a flick of her fluffy tail and a backward glance over her shoulder, Tallulah was gone. "I've never heard a cat sing like that before," said Peter. "In fact, I suppose I've never heard a cat sing." "Well, there's good and there's bad," said Roger. "Isn't she beautiful?" said Beatrice with a sigh. "If only Daddy could have heard her," said Peter. "He's a music publisher, you know. He's always saying he'd like to discover a real star." "Oh, yes, Tallulah is a star," said Beatrice, looking out hopefully into the garden, where once again all was dark and silent. In the morning, at the breakfast table, Peter was bursting to tell his parents about the events of the previous night. But Mr. Wise, hidden behind his newspaper, didn't seem to be in the mood for conversation. "What's that?" he said. "Cats singing? That's what I get in my office all day. Caterwauling." "But, Dad, she really was good." "I know, dear," said Mrs. Wise, arriving with a fresh pot of tea. "It sounds a marvellous dream, but do let your father finish his breakfast in peace or he'll miss his train." "It wasn't a dream," said Peter, and Beatrice chose that moment to get up from beside the fire and rub herself against his legs. All day long at school, Peter's thoughts kept wandering back to Tallulah. "Come on, Peter, we're all waiting for the answer," came the voice of Miss Philpott, the geography teacher. "Has the cat got your tongue?" At tea time it was the same. He didn't even finish his favourite peanut butter sandwiches. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Wise, "I do hope you're not going to go down with the flu." "If only I could get Daddy to listen to Tallulah," said Peter. "I'm sure he'd be impressed." Roger, who had been sitting under the table hoping that a morsel of peanut butter sandwich might come his way, seemed to nod his head in agreement. What did you say, dear?" said Mrs. Wise. "You sure you're all right?" Before Peter could reply, Roger, with a sudden great leap, landed on top of Mr. Wise's upright piano, on which rested a small tape recorder. "Come down at once," cried Mrs. Wise. "If you damage that machine, Mr. Wise will skin you alive." The tape recorder! That was it! Tonight Peter would record Tallulah's performance. He whisked Roger out of his mother's reach. "I'll see you later," he whispered. "She will be back, won't she?" Late that night, after his parents had gone to bed, Peter crept downstairs and carried the tape recorder from its place on top of the piano into the kitchen. Roger and Beatrice were already sitting on the draining board, all agog with excitement. "Oh, I can hardly wait," said Beatrice, hopping from paw to paw, her tail all a-quiver. "We may have to wait some time," said Roger, and he produced a piece of fried plaice, carefully wrapped in a sheet of newspaper. Would you care to join us?" Peter thought it might be rude to ask where the fish had come from. "No, thank you," he said, as he unwound the microphone from its case. "I do hope she comes soon." "Oh, she usually does," said Roger, licking a paw. "Oh, that is," said Beatrice, "unless she has a previous engagement." They had a long wait, but Tallulah didn't let them down. Only this time, as if she somehow knew the importance of the occasion, she appeared in a cloak of shimmering silver. Peter had remembered to switch on the tape recorder, and as Tallulah moved along the high garden wall, she seemed to him like a dazzling new constellation in the night sky. When at last Peter clambered into bed, he placed the precious spool of tape under his pillow, and went to sleep with Tallulah's voice still ringing in his ears. At the breakfast table, Mr. Wise was opening a large pile of mostly brown envelopes. "Oh, bills, bills, bills," he muttered gloomily. This isn't a bill, Dad." Peter nervously placed the tape on top of the pile. "I can see it isn't," said Mr. Wise. "It's one of my tapes. What are you doing with it?" When Peter had told him his story, Mr. Wise looked at him very sternly indeed. I think I'll go and put on another pot of tea," said Mrs. Wise, hurrying into the kitchen with Beatrice tiptoeing quietly after her. "Life isn't all fun and games, you know," said Mr. Wise, eyeing the bills. "If you've broken my tape recorder, I don't know what I shall do." "Oh, I was very careful, Daddy, honestly. Do listen to the tape." "I've no time for any more of this nonsense," said Mr. Wise, getting up from the table. But then a funny thing happened. As he was fetching his hat and coat, Peter put the tape on the machine. Tallulah's voice filled the room, and Mr. Wise, about to go and kiss his wife goodbye, seemed suddenly frozen in his tracks. When the song had finished, there was a long silence. Then Mr. Wise slowly removed his hat and coat and sat down again. "Peter," said Mr. Wise, "I must say that's one of the most remarkable sounds I have ever heard. Tell me the whole story again, from beginning to end." Mr. Wise didn't catch his usual train to the office that morning. Instead, he made many long telephone calls, while Mrs. Wise made many pots of tea. And that afternoon, with the tape in his briefcase, he took a taxi to an important-looking building in the centre of town. Above the entrance was a huge, flashing electric sign, which read, "Magnum Records." A doorman with white gloves and gold-braided uniform showed Mr. Wise into a panelled lift, which took him without stopping to the 27th floor. As he got out, he noticed that the white carpet was so deep that it almost covered the tops of his shoes. He passed rows of typists busily clicking away at hundreds of typewriters, and offices full of secretaries talking excitedly into coloured telephones. After a while, he came to the end of a long corridor and a pair of double doors on which was written in gold the name Mort Beanstalk, President. He knocked and entered. Come in," said a voice from behind an enormous mahogany desk. And there, his head just peeping over the top, was Mort Beanstalk himself. "Oh, we haven't seen so much of you lately," said Mr. Beanstalk. "Do sit down, sit down. What can we do for you?" Mr. Wise sat down in a shiny leather armchair and opened his briefcase. He began, but at that moment 2 white telephones on the desk began to ring. Excuse me," said Mr. Beanstalk. Put one telephone to each ear. "Yes," he said. "Oh, yes. No. Yes, goodbye." "Do go on," he said to Mr. Wise. "Well, you see," started Mr. Wise, "my son, Peter, that is," but this time he was interrupted by a door flying open and 3 lady secretaries entering with bundles of letters, all requiring Mr. Beanstalk's urgent signature. "Oh, you really must forgive me," said Mr. Beanstalk, selecting a green fountain pen. "I'll be with you in a few moments, okay?" But Mr. Wise, clasping the tape in his hands, could not be stopped. "Listen, it's this cat. Her name's Tallulah, and she has the most unusual singing voice." What's that? Said Mr. Beanstalk, stopping in the middle of a signature. A cat, did you say? Yes, said Mr. Wise, a singing cat. Mr. Beanstalk clapped his hands, and the three secretaries scurried out of the room. No more telephone calls, either, he shouted after them. Singing cat, eh? Mr. Beanstalk fitted the tape onto his expensive machine and flicked a few switches. Now this I just have to hear. He had only listened to a few seconds of Tallulah's performance when he stopped the tape and went to the door. Miss Yardhawk, he cried, send in promotion and publicity, contracts and exploitation, will you? Oh, and Miss Yardhawk, he added, a couple of bottles of champagne as well. Turning to Mr. Wise, a cigar, he said. Thank you, said Mr. Wise. But do you like her? Like her? I tell you, this cat is going to be a world star. Now listen, you and I are going to talk business, okay? In a minute or two, the room was swarming with people from every department of Magnum Records. There was Mr. Hyper from promotion, Mr. Mockup from publicity, Miss Copyright from contracts, and Mr. Scruple from exploitation, not to mention their assistants, secretaries, and office boys. Everyone became very excited, and Tallulah's tape was played from start to finish, over and over again. Well, there's only one thing I need, said Mr. Beanstalk. Tallulah must sign our official agreement. There's no problem there, I take it. No, none whatsoever, said Mr. Wise, a little uneasily. Oh, splendid, splendid. Miss Yardhawk, more champagne, please, okay? Oh, and book the large recording studio for tomorrow afternoon. Meanwhile, Peter was back from school, and with Roger and Beatrice was eagerly awaiting his father's return. No sooner did they hear his key in the lock than they all rushed into the hall to greet him. All right, said the tired but happy Mr. Wise. Let me just take my hat and coat off, and I'll tell you everything. When they had heard his good news, Peter jumped up and down with excitement, and the two cats chased one another in and out of every room in the house. The important thing now, said Mr. Wise, is for me to meet Tallulah. Oh, shall we invite her over this evening? Asked Peter. Mrs. Wise glanced at the clock. Well, if I hurry, there would just be time to bake a fish pie. Mr. Wise put on his spectacles and sat down at his desk. On a white card, he wrote in neat copperplate, Mr. and Mrs. Wise and Peter, at home. 6:30 p.m. He put the card in an envelope and marked it, Miss Tallulah. Then he added, by special delivery. Peter found the cat still playing games on the upstairs landing. He handed the envelope to Roger. Special delivery, eh? Said Roger. Can you manage it? There will be fish pie. Beatrice licked her lips. No problem, said Roger, and he was out through the kitchen door and off over the garden wall. At 6:30, a delicious smell of cooking was wafting through the house. Mr. Wise had put on his favourite blue suit and a red silk tie and was piling logs onto an already blazing fire. Peter had brushed his hair until it shone and had tied a pink bow round Beatrice's neck. Roger, who had been absent for some time, was still trying to disentangle some twigs and burrs from his fur. The grandfather clock struck 7:15. Dinner's ready, called Mrs. Wise from the kitchen. I do hope she won't keep us waiting. There was a scratching noise at the front door. I'll go, said Peter. He opened the door, and there in the light from a street lamp stood Tallulah in a long white evening dress. How rude of me to be so late, she said. I'm afraid I was a little delayed. Oh, never mind, said Peter. Won't you come in? He was about to close the door behind her when a large brown paw thrust itself inside. "Oh, how silly of me," said Tallulah. "I almost forgot to introduce my manager, Mr. Harry Fish." Peter looked round the door, and there on the step was a grinning tomcat wearing a loud check suit and a green trilby hat perched on his head. "Pleased to meet you," said Harry Fish with a small bow, and hopped inside. "Oh, well, this is a surprise," said Mr. Wise. "Yes, isn't it?" said Mrs. Wise, as she hurriedly laid an extra knife and fork at the table. "Oh, very nice little place you have here," said Mr. Fish. He handed his hat to Roger, who seemed uncertain what to do with it. Shall we sit down to eat?" said Mr. Wise. "Won't you be joining us?" Tallulah whispered to Beatrice as they went to the table. But there were no places laid for the household cats, who had to make do with their usual position under the table. Tallulah and Harry Fish sat raised up on high velvet cushions, and Mrs. Wise kept a watchful eye on their claws. The fish pie was a tremendous success, especially with Harry Fish, and as they heard him accept his fourth helping, Roger and Beatrice sadly realized that there would be little, if any, left for them. Have you been her manager long?" inquired Mr. Wise. "Oh, no," Tallulah began, but Harry Fish silenced her with a dark look. "Well, let's put it this way," he said, leaning over the table. "I take care of any big deals for Tallulah. Any big deals, important contracts, that sort of thing. Artists need to be protected, you know. There's so many villains about. Tallulah never makes a move without my say-so." "I see," said Mr. Wise. "But I'm sure we'll be able to come to a satisfactory arrangement," said Harry Fish, and he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Well, I don't know about anyone else," said Peter, who wasn't interested in business talk, "but I should like to hear Tallulah sing." "Oh, that would be nice," said Mrs. Wise, "if it's all right with Mr. Fish." But Harry Fish, well filled with her delicious pie, did not answer. In fact, he was fast asleep. Permission or no, Tallulah stepped briskly onto the table as Mrs. Wise quickly cleared some dishes to make room for her. Mr. Wise sat down at the piano. "Whenever you're ready," he said. Roger and Beatrice jumped onto Tallulah's empty chair in order to get a better view, and Peter banged a spoon and fork together in time with the music. "Oh, isn't she good?" exclaimed Peter, his eyes shining. Mr. and Mrs. Wise agreed. Absolutely magnificent. Beatrice clapped her paws in admiration and tried to peer into the pie dish, which was, unfortunately, completely empty. "Well, I have a great deal of work to do for the recording session tomorrow," said Mr. Wise, getting up from the piano. "I can see I shall be up all night, what with the orchestral arrangements and the musicians to book." "Ah, yes, bookings and musicians," said Harry Fish, suddenly sitting up straight. "Don't worry, I see to all that sort of thing, for a small fee, of course." "Fee?" said Mr. Wise. "And naturally there will also be the usual management charges as far as Tallulah is concerned." "Charges?" said Mr. Wise. "And I trust you have no objection to providing us with a car and a driver?" Harry Fish got down from his chair and brushed some pastry crumbs from his waistcoat. "Oh, come now, Mr. Fish, let's not run before we can walk. After all, Tallulah isn't a star yet, you know." "Well, I say she is." Harry Fish took his green hat and rammed it firmly on his head. "So if you don't like my terms, there are others who will." "Oh, please, Harry," said Tallulah, and she put a paw on his check sleeve. I know you want the best for me, but look, you save your voice for singing, all right? Growled Harry Fish, and let me do the talking. Couldn't we make the record first? Said Peter. Yes, I'm sure we'd be able to settle all the little details afterwards, said Tallulah. Harry Fish gave a great yawn. Oh, all right, he said. I'll tell you what, though, I should be most obliged if you could let me have some loose change for the journey home. I seem to be a little short. While this business was being dealt with, Tallulah went up to Mrs. Wise and whispered, "It was the best fish pie I've ever tasted." And to Peter, "Thank you." As soon as Mr. Wise had closed the front door behind his guests, the telephone rang.
Mort Beanstalk here.
Yes, Mr. Beanstalk?
Is everything set for tomorrow?
Oh, everything's fine.
No, problems?
None whatsoever. At least I, hope not, said Mr. Wise to himself as he replaced the receiver. The recording studio at Magnum Records was like a vast underground cavern. Bright-coloured spotlights shone down onto a mass of cables and microphones and musical instruments of every shape and kind. At one end was a large glass window, behind which was the control room. Engineers in white coats were busy testing the equipment and reading dials. The studio clock said 2:15 precisely when Mr. Wise entered carrying a case full of music. Peter followed with a wicker basket. Inside were Roger and Beatrice, who had been allowed to come as a special treat, and also because they had missed out on last night's fish pie. "Well, that's strange," said Mr. Wise. "I don't see any musicians. I do hope Mr. Fish can be relied upon." Peter and his father were busy setting out the musical arrangements on stands in front of the empty chairs, when a very peculiar crowd started to arrive. There were beagles and dachshunds and golden retrievers, Manx cats and parrots and dormice and voles. There were weasels and lizards and rabbits and ravens, and an owl and a mongoose, and 2 or 3 moles. And the last to enter were Harry Fish and Tallulah. "All right, boys," shouted Harry Fish. "Settle down now." He turned to Mr. Wise and whispered, "Some of the finest musicians in the business." "Well, let's hope so," said Mr. Wise. Peter ran up to Tallulah. "Oh, isn't it exciting? A real studio." "You know, I feel a little bit nervous," said Tallulah.
Is everyone ready?
Said the chief engineer through the loudspeaker from the control room.
May I hear the song from the top, please?
There was a sound of shuffling and scraping, squeaking and flapping of wings, and Peter couldn't help noticing, as the musicians took their places, that one of the ravens had got his beak caught in the strings of a cello. Several dachshunds seemed uncertain which way up to hold their trombones, and a rabbit had settled down to sleep inside the French horn. Some of the others were undecided which instrument to choose. Indeed, there were many more musicians than there were instruments to play. For instance, in one corner of the studio, 2 parrots were squabbling ferociously over a tambourine. Mr. Wise climbed onto the conductor's stand and tapped the rail with his baton. "Gentlemen," he said, "silence, please." He raised his hands, and as he brought the baton down, a most extraordinary noise rose from the assembled orchestra. "Ah, what did I tell you?" said Harry Fish approvingly. "The finest musicians in town." Tallulah opened her mouth to sing, but seemed unable to find the right place to come in. "Oh, it all sounds so different with a proper orchestra," she said to Peter. Suddenly the mongoose, who was hitting the drum kit for all he was worth, went straight through the skin of the side drum and fell headlong into it. The drum toppled off its stand, and gathering speed, rolled through the centre of the orchestra, scattering animals and instruments on all sides. Finally, there was a dreadful crash, and it went straight through the plate-glass window into the control room. There was a shocked silence. "Mr. Fish," said Mr. Wise, "may I have a word with you?" Sensing trouble, the musicians were scuttling to the studio door, falling over each other in their haste to escape. In a few minutes, all that remained of Harry Fish's orchestra were a pile of broken instruments and some torn sheets of music.
Excuse me for 1 second,
said Harry Fish.
There are a couple of matters I really must attend to at once.
And with that, he too darted nimbly out of the studio. "Oh, Dad, it's all going wrong, isn't it?" said Peter. "To put it mildly," said Mr. Wise. He shook his head grimly and climbed down from the conductor's stand.
Only 10 minutes of recalling time left,
shouted the chief engineer through the broken glass window. "Listen, everybody," said Tallulah. "I've been thinking." "Well, go on," said Mr. Wise. "Well, you remember when I sang for you last night? You played piano, and Peter was on spoon and fork." "Yes," said Peter. "Well, I think I really preferred that to Harry's orchestra. It was more me, somehow." Roger and Beatrice brushed themselves against Peter's legs to show they agreed. "Well, it's worth a try, I suppose," said Mr. Wise, sitting down at a very grand piano. "But I don't have a spoon and fork," said Peter. "Well, look," said Tallulah. "You see those 2 drumsticks? In the control room there's a metal tape box. You could bang that." Roger and Beatrice hopped from foot to foot expectantly. "And you two," she went on, "perhaps you could manage some backing voices." The 2 cats needed no second invitation. Oh, they jumped onto a tall stool in front of a microphone and began to practice. Tallulah adjusted a pair of blue earphones on her head and cleared her throat. The chief engineer started the tape machine. A red light winked on in the studio, and Mr. Wise began to count softly. A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4.
Everybody sing my song. My song. Everybody sing my song. My song. Come on, you won't go wrong with me. Everybody sing my song. Everybody stamp your feet. Everybody stamp your feet. Come on, join in the beat with me. Everybody stamp your feet. Everybody whisper low. Shh. Everybody whisper low. Shh. Softly. Down you go with me. Everybody whisper low. Everybody shout out loud. Everybody shout out loud. Come on, now there's a crowd of you. Everybody shout out loud. Everybody hold your nose. Everybody hold your nose. Oh no, I don't suppose you'd mind if I make you hold your nose. Everybody sing my song. Everybody sing my song. Come on, you won't go wrong with me. Everybody sing my song. Everybody whistle up. Everybody whistle down. Whistle up and down. Everybody sound like a bell. Everybody sound like a bell. Ding dong, you're doing well, so let's everybody sound like a bell. Everybody hug and kiss. Everybody hug and kiss. Come on, see what you missed, and let's everybody hug and kiss. Everybody sing my song.
When the last notes of Tallulah's song had died away, Mr. Wise shouted to the chief engineer, "Did you get it all down?" "It's all on the tape, Mr. Wise," said the chief engineer. "Just in time, too. Why don't you come in and listen?" They all crowded into the control room, and the chief engineer was about to press the button when the door opened, and in stepped Mort Beanstalk. "Hello, everybody," he said, waving a fat cigar. "How's it all going?" "Well, she's certainly got a powerful voice, sir," said the chief engineer. "Yeah, so I see," said Mr. Beanstalk, looking at the broken window. "Here it comes," said the chief engineer, starting the tape machine. Mr. Beanstalk listened carefully to Tallulah's voice coming from 8 different loudspeakers in front of him. Occasionally, he would slightly adjust 1 or 2 of the hundreds of knobs on the control panel. It was very hard to tell what he was thinking. When the tape stopped, he sat down in the chief engineer's chair and took a deep puff at his cigar. Then he turned round to face them. "I like it," he said with a big smile. "I like it a lot. What a voice and a most unusual arrangement," he said to Mr. Wise. "Oh, say no more," said the voice of Harry Fish, who had slipped in unnoticed. "All in a day's work." "Who is this cat?" demanded Mr. Beanstalk. The name is Fish, sir, and as Tallulah's manager, I should like to have a brief word with you about financial matters." "Manager?" said Mr. Beanstalk, looking sharply at Mr. Wise. "This is the first I hear of a manager. In any case, I prefer to deal with my artistes direct. Now, my dear," he said, turning to Tallulah, "I should like you to sign this piece of paper, and in return, I propose to offer you £500. "Oh, dear," gasped Tallulah, who had never had much to do with money. It seemed an enormous sum. Mr. Beanstalk looked a little put out. Is that not enough?" he said. "What else would you like?" "Well, what I really like," said Tallulah, flustered, "is salmon. Fresh salmon. And smoked salmon." Mr. Beanstalk laughed. "You shall have salmon. Oh, dear, as much as you can eat. Furthermore, I give you permission to use the company car whenever you have an engagement." "Done," said Harry Fish, producing an orange fountain pen and handing it to Tallulah. "Now just sign wherever Mr. Beanstalk tells you, all right?" Everyone pressed forward as Tallulah slowly wrote her name. And when she had finished, there was a round of applause. Then Mr. Beanstalk handed her a bundle of £20 notes, neatly tied with a red ribbon, and everyone applauded again. "Yes, well, I'd better take care of that," said Harry Fish. He stretched out a paw. Mr. Beanstalk rose to his feet. "Well done, everybody," he said. "I'm sure Tallulah and Magnum Records are going to have a great deal of success together." And he was gone. "Now then," said the chief engineer, "who's going to settle this bill for damage to windows and musical instruments?" I think Mr. Fish would like that," said Mr. Wise. "He sees to all that sort of thing." So began Tallulah's amazing recording career. Her first record was to be released in 2 weeks' time, and there was a tremendous amount to be done. The company car was soon in constant use, running Tallulah and Harry Fish from appointment to appointment. There were photographs to be taken, in colour and black and white, stage clothes to be designed and fitted, interviews to be given to all the most important newspaper writers, and a big concert was being arranged by Magnum for the day on which the record was to appear. It seemed that the name Tallulah was already on everyone's lips, and even Mr. Wise found his small publishing office busier than it had ever been. Peter and the 2 household cats had to be content with following Tallulah's progress in newspapers and magazines, and there were no more midnight performances on the garden wall. As he was returning from fishing in a local pond one afternoon, Peter noticed 2 men pasting up an enormous coloured poster, which read, "Magnum Records, in association with Harold Fish, proudly present the fabulous Tallulah in concert. When he reached home, he begged his parents to be allowed to go, and Mr. Wise could hardly refuse. The big day arrived, and Peter and his mother and father set off for the theatre. Well, you've never seen such a crowd. The theatre was completely sold out, except for a few tickets that were being offered at an extremely high price outside. And behind the salesmen's caps and mufflers, Peter thought he recognized some of Harry Fisher's studio musicians. "Oh, there's the stage door," cried Peter. "May I go and wish Tallulah good luck?" He ran in, and at the end of a long brick passage, he found a door with a gold star painted on it. He knocked and waited. There was a clatter of tin cans from inside. "Who's there?" said the voice of Harry Fish. "It's me, Peter Wise." "No unauthorized visitors," said Harry Fish. There were more clattering noises. "Don't be so silly, Harry," came Tallulah's voice. "Open the door." There was a further tremendous clattering. After what seemed a long while, Harry Fish opened the door a few inches and looked out. Yes?" he said. "I've come to wish Tallulah good luck." "Oh, how sweet of you," he heard Tallulah say. Through the crack, he caught a glimpse of her wiping her mouth with a towel, and at the same time kicking an empty salmon tin under the dressing table. He could also hardly help noticing a very large pile of unopened cans in one corner. It seemed that Mr. Beanstalk had kept his word. "I'll have to go," said Peter. "We'll be sitting in the second row, so you'll be able to hear us cheering." The concert was a great success, and Tallulah, dressed all in powder blue, won the hearts of the whole audience. In one song, lit by a single spotlight, she sat on the very edge of the stage, and to Peter it seemed that she was singing to him alone.
If I had a friend like you, someone I could be close to, suddenly the world would seem a nicer place. I would find a smile in every gloomy face. It's true, if I had a friend like you. If I had a friend who cared, I'd do things I've never dared. Look up at a star and feel it's in my reach. Bring out all the love that's waiting deep in each of us. If I had a friend like you. When I'm alone and feeling sad, I sometimes wonder where my life is going. Then thoughts of you come to my mind. Might we be friends? Is there some way of knowing? If I had a friend to love, like the friend I'm dreaming of, everything would sparkle in a summer light. Days would seem unending and the sky at night stay blue. If I had a friend just like you.
When the curtain finally fell, the audience rose to its feet and stamped and clapped and shouted for more, and the scenes of excitement were carried by television cameras to every home in the land. Next morning, Mr. Wise was reading the newspaper report of the concert aloud when the telephone rang. It was Mort Beanstalk.
Good news,
he said. "Oh, really?" said Mr. Wise.
Well, I can tell you we've never had a record like it. Already this morning, we've had 100,000 orders from all over the country. By this time next week, Tallulah will be #1 in the charts.
And #1 she was, for 10 whole weeks in a row. Very soon you couldn't turn on the radio or the television or open a newspaper without hearing or seeing Tallulah. And Mr. Fish, too, who made sure he was never left out. Harry Fish took to wearing very expensive, shiny silk suits and smoking cigars even fatter than Mr. Beanstalk's. He opened an impressive suite of offices in the centre of town, with Harry Fish Promotions painted on one door and Fish International on the other. The walls were panelled in the finest oak, and the white carpet was every inch as deep as the one at Magnum Records. He liked nothing better than talking on his new gold telephone, arranging bookings for Tallulah. Unfortunately, through his carelessness, many of these turned out to be on the same day. On one occasion, they arrived by train in France, when Tallulah should have been opening a bazaar in Frinton. "I knew it began with an F," said Harry Fish, but the French ticket collector didn't seem to enjoy the joke. In spite of Harry Fish's mismanagement, Tallulah's fame grew and grew. But, sad to say, so did her appetite for salmon. For those who could read between the lines in the newspapers, it became increasingly clear that all was not well. Among the reports of her great triumphs and hit records, Mr. Wise sometimes picked out other items. "Tallulah, slightly indisposed," said one headline. Then, "Tallulah misses concert." And one day, "Tallulah cancels tour. Top vets called in." "Oh, poor thing," said Mrs. Wise. "She can't be eating properly." Peter was about to bring up the subject of salmon, when Mr. Wise continued reading aloud from the paper. "Her manager, Mr. Harold Fish, in an exclusive interview with the Daily Globe, stated, 'It's all due to her appetite for work. She just can't say no. I'm taking Tallulah away on a sea cruise to Sardinia, and when we come back, she will give a television spectacular for all her fans.'" There were crowds of well-wishers on the quayside as Tallulah weakly climbed the gangway, leaning on the arm of Harry Fish. Several months passed before they returned. When the evening of the promised television show came at last, the Wise family were gathered eagerly around the set. "Now the moment we have all been waiting for. We are proud to present the world-famous feline songstress, the sensational Tallulah." The band struck up the introduction to her new record. Tallulah, dressed entirely in salmon pink, descended a long white staircase. "She's put on a little weight," whispered Mrs. Wise. Tallulah smiled into the camera and opened her mouth to sing. But not a single note came out. After a while, the band stopped. Then they played the introduction again. Still, there was no sound from Tallulah's open mouth. Roger and Beatrice clasped each other in alarm. Tallulah gave a tiny cough and put a paw to her throat. She glanced nervously towards the edge of the screen, where Harry Fish could be plainly seen, signalling frantically to her. "Come on, Peter," said Mr. Wise. "I'm afraid something dreadful has happened. We're going to find out what it is." Outside the television studios, a large crowd had collected. Mr. Wise took Peter by the hand and shouted, "Let us through, please, let us through." The crowd made way for them, and they hurried to Tallulah's dressing room, where a very sorry scene met their gaze. In the centre, Tallulah was laid out on a low couch, her mouth still wide open. A worried group surrounded her. There were television producers, reporters, and Mort Beanstalk himself, solemnly shaking his head. In one corner, sitting on an upturned waste paper basket, in front of a mountain of empty salmon tins, was the crumpled figure of Harry Fish. He was weeping and muttering to himself,
"Oh, this is terrible. This is terrible,"
and blowing his nose into a spotted handkerchief. "Fish," said Mr. Wise very sternly, "what have you done now?" Harry Fish blew his nose again.
"It's not me," he sobbed. "There's a big salmon bone stuck in her throat."
"Oh, poor Tallulah," said Peter, kneeling down beside the couch and gently stroking a limp paw. "How can we get it out?" There was a weak gurgling sound from Tallulah, who opened one eye and looked beseechingly up at Peter.
I've telephoned the vet," said Mr. Beanstalk, consulting his watch, "but I fear there may not be much time."
Then Peter had an idea. He rummaged in his pockets and brought out a length of string on the end of which was a hook. He used this on his fishing expeditions. "Daddy," he said, "let me try. I think I might be able to do something." Mr. Wise looked at Mort Beanstalk's serious expression and said, "Well, all right, but be very careful." Everyone drew back a step or two as Peter slowly lowered the hook into Tallulah's gaping mouth. He gave a couple of tiny tugs without finding anything. Tallulah groaned. The third time, the hook caught firmly onto the salmon bone. "Got it," said Peter. "Now comes the hard bit. I'll try not to hurt you, Tallulah." With one sharp jerk, the bone was out. Tallulah sat up and croaked, Oh, my goodness. Oh, that's better. Thank you, Peter. I think you saved my life." Mr. Beanstalk picked Peter up and sat him on his shoulders so that everyone could see him. All the reporters wrote his name down in their notebooks, and a photographer took his picture, and by now Harry Fish, too, seemed much recovered. "I told you too much salmon would be your undoing," he said, wagging a paw at Tallulah.
"Well, I'm afraid the fault is partly mine," said Mr. Beanstalk. "Artistes can so easily become spoilt by a taste for high living."
"I don't think I could ever face another piece of salmon in my life," said Tallulah, feeling quite ill at the thought.
"Good," said Mr. Beanstalk. "I only hope that the events of this evening haven't damaged your career."
When Peter and his father arrived home, it was very late. Mrs. Wise was waiting up for them. She hugged them both and said, "Oh, I've been so worried." "Everything's all right, thanks to Peter's quick thinking," said Mr. Wise. "We can both be very proud of him." Tallulah kept her word about the salmon. In fact, she made it very plain to Harry Fish that she was sick and tired of her life of luxury. She no longer wanted to be driven around in the Magnum Records limousine, nor did she wish to spend most of her days in hairdressers and beauty parlors. "But Tallulah," cried Harry Fish, "if you're a star, you must behave like one. Your public demands it." "In that case," said Tallulah, "I'm not sure I want to be a star." Which was probably just as well, for it had to be admitted that what with her many cancelled engagements, the salmon bone incident, and Harry Fish's increasing mismanagement, the public were not quite so in love with Tallulah as they had been. The theatres were no longer packed out for her performances, and Harry Fish's salesmen found few buyers for their expensive tickets. To add to this, her latest record was not doing at all well, and there would have been many grim faces in the corridors of Magnum Records had they not just discovered a singing chimpanzee. whose stage act was reported to be remarkably exciting. Soon, all the talk among Peter's classmates concerned this new rising star. It was therefore most unexpected when, after dinner one evening, Mr. Wise received a telephone call from Mort Beanstalk.
Splendid news. I just can't understand it. We thought Tallulah's new record was dead, but today we've suddenly had the most enormous sale.
Good Lord, said Mr. Wise. Have you told Harry Fish?
Well, now that's the strange thing. There seems to be no answer from his number. Tallulah's been trying too. I wonder if you'd be kind enough to go round to his office and ask him to contact me. The television companies are sure to be after her now that her record's doing so well.
I'll come too, said Peter to his father, and they set off at once for Fish International. On the doorstep, they met Tallulah, who was rattling the doorknob and trying to peer through the letterbox. I'm sure he's in there, she said. I can hear some strange noises. They all listened for a moment, and there could be no doubt there were sounds of whispering and laughing from within. Mr. Wise rapped on the door with his umbrella. There was a silence. Then more whispering, and the sound of a door being shut. "Open up!" called Mr. Wise. "I have some good news for you." "I know," said Harry Fish, finally unbolting the front door and looking very pleased with himself. "It's good management that does it. Come on in, have some champagne." "Not for me, thank you," said Tallulah, sitting down on a large cardboard box. At that moment, the door that read Harry Fish Promotions flew open, and in staggered 3 of Mr. Fish's salesmen, each carrying similar cardboard boxes. "That's the lot," panted one of them, banging his box down on the floor. "Well done, fellas. I was just about to open some champagne," said Harry Fish. "Won't you join us?" He unlocked a cupboard door, and out poured an avalanche of shiny black records. "What's this?" asked Mr. Wise. "And what's this?" cried Tallulah, opening the box on which she had been sitting. Inside were many more newly pressed records, all of them copies of her latest release. "That's your new hit," said Harry Fish proudly. "That's what it is. My boys have paid a visit to every record shop in the country." "Do you mean to say that you have bought all these records yourself?" said Mr. Wise in amazement. "Well, someone had to," said Harry Fish. "Would you like a few dozen?" Tallulah sat down on the cardboard box again and began to cry. That's cheating," she sobbed. "I'm not really popular at all." "But Tallulah," said Harry Fish, "I only did it for you." "I think not, Fish," said Mr. Wise, looking round at the panelled walls and the thick white carpet. "I suspect you have been finding your own uses for Tallulah's money for quite long enough. If you really cared for her at all, you would know that this," he indicated the piles of records that littered the floor, "would be the last thing she would want." "But she'll be number 1 again," said Harry Fish, "which will be very good for us all." "Not if I have anything to do with it," said Tallulah. She reached for the gold telephone and dialed a number. "I refuse to be number 1 by trickery." "What are you doing?" cried Harry Fish, running round the desk in alarm. "Hello?" said Tallulah into the receiver. "Is that the Daily Globe? This is Tallulah. I want to make a statement." Tallulah told the reporter the whole story of Harry Fish's dishonest scheme, and ended, "I have decided to retire from show business." "Good for you, Tallulah," said Mr. Wise. He turned to Harry Fish, who seemed to have shrunk inside his silk suit. "I suggest you give to Tallulah whatever money remains, and then make yourself scarce if you want to avoid criminal proceedings." Harry Fish was trembling at the knees. Seeing that Mr. Wise meant business, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out one last, grubby, £20 note. That's all there is," he said sadly. He handed the note to Tallulah, who popped it into her purse. "Never mind," she said, quite cheerfully. "I've just had an idea." In the taxi on the way home, Tallulah hummed happily to herself and tapped her purse thoughtfully. "Oh, poor old Mr. Fish," laughed Peter. "He did look upset. Do you think he'll ever get over it?" "I'm afraid he will," said Mr. Wise. Tallulah spent that night at the Wise household. Roger gallantly insisted that she should have his place in the basket with Beatrice, while he slept uncomfortably on the kitchen table. Next morning, when Peter opened his bedroom curtains, he found that there had been a heavy fall of snow, and he noticed many sets of cats' footprints criss-crossing the garden. When he went downstairs, it was plain that Tallulah, Roger, and Beatrice were already out on some kind of business. "They must be up to something," said Mrs. Wise. "They insisted on going straight out into the cold as soon as I came down." Returning from school that afternoon, Peter discovered that a bonfire had been mysteriously built in the middle of the garden, and the trees were hung with little paper lanterns. He caught sight of Roger trotting purposefully across the snow. "What's going on?" said Peter. Roger gave him a wink. "Can't stop now," he said breathlessly. "There's going to be a party. 6 o'clock this evening. You're all invited." When Peter next looked out of the window, he saw that a row of large platters, each covered with a check cloth, had appeared along the top of the high wall, and a tray, laden with different-coloured milkshakes, had been placed on the garden table. At 6:15, Beatrice put her head round the kitchen door. "Do you think your father would mind lighting the bonfire and the lanterns for us?" she said. "Only I'm not too good with matches." "Oh, I'm sure he will," said Peter. "But do tell me, what's this party all about?" "It's Tallulah's farewell party," said Beatrice, and disappeared. Mr. Wise pulled on his gumboots, and in no time the bonfire was blazing merrily, and the lanterns were glowing among the branches. As Peter and his mother stepped out into the cold, clear night, an amazing scene met their eyes. Scrambling under the snow-covered hedge, and jumping from the garden wall, and sliding down the creeper, came the most bedraggled selection of kittens they had ever seen. It was as if all the homeless strays of the whole city were gathering in the Wises' back garden. Roger was busy seating them in a circle round the bonfire, while Beatrice was handing out plates of the most delicious food, lobster and scampi, prawns and shrimps, liver and chicken, and as many second helpings of blancmange and cream as were asked for. There was a special place reserved for Mr. and Mrs. Wise and Peter on the swing hammock, and a dish of hot sausage rolls had been provided especially for them. "Oh, what a lovely party," said Mrs. Wise. "But where is our hostess?" Then, just like that night, so many months before, the full moon sailed out from behind a bank of clouds. Its light, reflected from the snowy ground, lit up the wall like a stage. And stepping into the limelight to give the performance of her life came none other than Tallulah. A great rumble of purring rose from the audience of kittens, who gazed up at her admiringly. Song followed song, favourites old and new, and even some ancient kitten lullabies that she had learned from her mother.
Billowing clouds, now will pillow your sleeping, so close those tired eyes, for the times pass for weeping. A staircase of moonbeams will lead you to moon dreams. The stars are all waiting to wish you good night. The fisherman's boat is safe home in the harbor, and each little child finds his mother and father. All sadness and sorrow must wait till tomorrow, and everything's quiet now the world's gone to bed. A staircase of moonbeams will lead you to moon dreams. The stars are all twinkling. Good night, sleepyhead. Sadness and sorrow must wait till tomorrow, and everything's quiet now the world's gone to bed.
When she had finished, some of the younger members of the audience were in tears, from a mixture of sadness and happiness. Even Mr. Wise seemed to have got some bonfire smoke in his eyes. Tallulah sat on the wall and spoke in a low voice. "My dear friends, I am so happy that you could all come to my farewell party, and I hope that you have all had a good time." Everybody clapped. Since I last appeared here, I have had many fascinating experiences, but I have never been as happy as I am tonight. The time has come, however, for me to move on, she continued. "Oh, no," cried Peter, jumping to his feet. "You must stay here with us, and Roger and Beatrice. Please do." Tallulah held up a paw. "Much as I would like to stay," she said, "there are so many different things I feel I have yet to do. I'm sure you will understand." She gazed hopefully up at the shining moon, took one last look at her audience, and then, with a fluff of her tail, she sprang into the night.